There had always been conflicting opinions amongst the soldiers of the 551st Parachute Battalion about where Mule Mallinson's nickname had come from. Some suggested the first sergeant had inherited it because of a stubborn, unyielding defence of the men he was responsible for. Others confidently asserted that his athletic frame belied a talented college football career, during which he had displayed what was rumoured to be a legendary kicking ability. For his own part, Mallinson enjoyed maintaining such debate, particularly as the reality was far more mundane. Born into a large family, to parents with a passion for older and underused names, he was eventually christened as Lemuel. For his 4 older brothers, each possessing a similarly quirky surname of their own, it took little imagination to shorten their youngest sibling's first name to Mule. Weighing up his men's conflicting opinions, Mule Mallinson accepted that he could be stubborn on occasion, an attribute he had used to try and protect his company since they had first parachuted into southern France. Sadly, it had been nowhere near enough for many of them. The battalion had spent the first 6 months of the campaign covering the right flank of the 7th Army, which was busily cleaning out the retreating enemy forces from the French Alps. During this period, there had been a significant amount of rest and relaxation, with little actual risk. But all of that changed with the surprise German offensive that erupted from the depths of the Ardennes forest. The paratroopers of the 551st suddenly found themselves redeployed to spearhead an American counterattack, plunged into a series of bloody and brutal engagements. Again and again they were thrown up against seasoned and well-armed German units, sustaining heavy losses but somehow succeeding in winning the day. Finally though, during an ill-conceived attack on the banks of the Sambre River, their luck ran out. Under orders to attack across open ground covered in a thick blanket of snow, the paratroopers had come under heavy fire from German artillery. Of the 700 men who had marched into the Ardennes that Christmas, less than 100 remained, with Mallinson, one of the few surviving NCOs. Rumour was, the casualties sustained by the 551st were so catastrophic, the unit was to be disbanded, with the survivors sent home along with the wounded. Hopefully, this was why Mule now found himself dragged away from his breakfast, in order to report to the battalion command post. Having waited for an hour in the freezing cold outside the briefing tent, when he was finally invited inside, Mule was in little mood for pleasantries. Perhaps recognising his irritation, the major from the 82nd Airborne who had summoned him made the briefing short and to the point. The surviving members of the 551st were to be absorbed into the All-American Division. Mallinson himself would receive a battlefield promotion to the rank of second lieutenant in recognition of his recent actions, with one final mission to carry out before his existing unit was formally disbanded. To the north of Saint-Hubert lay a particularly inaccessible patch of forest, which the Americans had bypassed during their counter-offensive. With the German forces now pushed back beyond their original positions, the Third Army had ordered a small force into this area to clear it of enemy occupation. After several days, when nothing had been heard from this unit, a similarly sized patrol was pulled together and duly dispatched to investigate. But this force had now also vanished, causing no small degree of concern. With the tightly packed nature of the trees in the region and the thickness of the overhead canopy, reconnaissance attempts using vehicles and aircraft had proven impossible. There was little option available to the commanders beyond sending in a third patrol. The missing units were composed largely of young and inexperienced troops. As a result, somebody further up the chain of command had decided the third attempt should involve battle-hardened soldiers, which is why the survivors of the 551st had been selected. Mallinson was issued with orders to pull whatever weapons and equipment he required, ensuring the men he selected were suitable for the task. It took what remained of Mule's self-control from ramming his promotion papers straight down the major's throat, before he stalked from the tent, back out into the cold. Mule's route back to the remnants of the battalion seemed to take an eternity, as he ran through the surviving paratroopers in his head. Given he didn't know what he would be facing, at minimum he would need a full company, meaning roughly a third of the remaining men. But few of those sprawled out around the forest floor as he approached had emerged from their last battle in a fit state for combat. Be they physical injuries or much deeper psychological scars, most of the survivors now visibly carried the overwhelming weight of the war upon their shoulders. A lack of available options made the patrol's leadership the easy part. Although he had refused to be taken away with the rest of the wounded, the shrapnel injury to Sergeant Castillo's leg prevented him from moving much faster than a brisk limp. so it was agreed he would remain behind, in charge of the camp. In terms of NCOs, Mac Mackenzie had probably walked away from the Somme River debacle with pretty much the same emotional baggage he had started out with, so he had been appointed as Mallinson's 2IC. This left the 3rd Platoon the responsibility of Johnny Greywolf. The Native American corporal was a giant of a man who heralded from the Pacific Northwest. He was held in high esteem by his men, perhaps to an even greater degree than Mallinson, the tomahawk axe he wore on his belt inspiring fear and awe in those he encountered. Of greater debate was the composition of the enlisted men. After discounting those deemed too emotionally broken by their recent ordeal, or nursing significant injury, Mallinson and his subordinates soon found themselves struggling to find the full 30 men they required. In particular, they had been loath to select Marino, the arrogant little shitweasel from New York, but the punk kid had somehow managed to emerge from their last battle unscathed, along with Private Enzo, the loathsome sycophant that followed his fellow Italian round everywhere. There were also misgivings about Private Davis, the sports jock with the tendency to run his mouth. But despite his arrogance, the Texan youth was as handy with his fists as he was with a machine pistol, so given the circumstances it was conceded he was worth the risk. After representations from Mackenzie and Greywolf, Mallinson agreed to dispense with the company's mortar teams. The thick forestry where they were heading limited the chances of encountering any enemy armour or substantial fortifications, and would likely render the weapons somewhat impractical. Instead, they would rely on heavy machine guns, along with a couple of flamethrowers. In the event they did encounter a German force of significant size, they would fall back and report the encounter to headquarters, rather than risk being drawn into a losing battle. Having ensured the selected men had got hot chow for their lunch, Mallinson gave orders for them to scavenge and scrounge whatever they needed from around the camp for their mission, before they finally loaded up into the back of their transportation and moved out. The snow had ceased several days before, with what remained on the ground now thawing. As a result, the forest tracks the trucks laboured through were naturally descending into thick quagmires. Eventually, several miles from their destination, they were forced to get out and continue on foot. Moving amongst his men, Mule tried his best to tackle the various moans and gripes this unanticipated trek had produced, whilst accepting he was fighting a losing battle. Finally, as the edge of the forest they had been ordered to inspect hove into view, he gave the order for arrest. For the next few minutes, the survivors of the 551st stared in contemplative silence at the near impenetrable wall of trees that lay before them, each wrapped up in his own private thoughts and misgivings. Then Greywolf was among them, his booming tones ordering them up, back into line. The thin column of disgruntled and weary soldiers trudged on, penetrating the tree line, disappearing from sight. Somewhere ahead of them, the fate of 2 American units was waiting to be discovered, and their own fate would soon be decided. Mallinson had not expected things to be easy, but the densely packed trees and flooded terrain made for particularly tough going. Several minor injuries had also slowed their progress, including a highly suspect twisted ankle, allegedly sustained by Marino. The paratroopers had been slowly threading their way through the thick conifers for about 2 hours, when a low and mournful wail brought them to an immediate halt. From somewhere close by, a lone male voice cried out in an American accent for help. Before Mallinson had time to give orders, Greywolf was already up at the head of the column, silently directing teams out to cover their flanks in the event this was a trap. Once he was satisfied any enemy threat was countered, the big corporal motioned for the column to fall in behind him, pacing cautiously forwards. They continued on a short way, the trees ahead noticeably thinning out before opening into a small clearing. Around this lay the shattered and broken remains of several pine trees, recently destroyed during some kind of battle, their trunks peppered with grenade damage and bullet holes. Knelt amongst the splintered foliage, upper body bent down close to the sodden ground, was a solitary male figure. His back was to them, but they could clearly see from a distance he wore a US infantry uniform, both arms clutched tightly around his chest. Another sorrowful moan issued forth from the figure, a desperate plea for help with injury. Greywolf's hand, though, remained stubbornly raised, preventing the patrol from moving forwards to assist. His eyes continued to scan the tree line opposite, searching out any possible danger or hazard. A further pitiful cry floated through the still afternoon air towards the waiting paratroopers, this time proving too much for Davis to ignore. Cursing his corporal, He shouldered his weapon and began to snake his way through the splintered wreckage and grenade craters towards the wounded man. The private turned once to find nobody else had stepped forward, before swearing again, resuming his journey. He was not far off the figure when another moan escaped its lips, causing him to stop in bewilderment. This time, the pain words that had been spoken were in German. For a moment, the young Texan hesitated, before rationalising that regardless of which nation this man fought for, he must be as desperate as to appeal to either side for assistance. Still, the outside chance this was one of the Germans they had heard of, who disguised themselves as GIs, prompted him to warily raise his Thompson. When he was but a few feet away, Davis halted, announcing his presence and asking where the injured man was hit. The kneeling figure immediately stopped moving, the low moans he'd been making ceasing. Ever so slowly, his arms extended out and up from his sides as he rose to his feet. The front of the injured man's uniform was torn wide open, revealing a shockingly pale and emaciated torso beneath it. He was thin and gaunt, to a degree that was painful to behold, with noticeably long nails on the skeletal fingers protruding from the end of each hand. Atop his head, the hair was patchy, with large clumps apparently missing, and his eyes seemed to be producing a dull yellowy glow. A low and sinister hiss escaped the soldier's mouth, before his lips drew back to reveal a jawline filled with sharpened teeth. The paratrooper watched on in horror as a thick line of saliva escaped from the side of the figure's mouth, dropping to the floor, before it suddenly issued forth an inhuman shriek. Two claw-like hands rose up from its sides, and it launched itself forward, directly at the private. Davis was fast, but his attacker was faster. As the Texan's index finger pulled back hard on the Thompson's trigger, the nightmare was already upon him, his burst disappearing off across the clearing. He cried out in fear, but razor-sharp teeth tore deep into his throat, instantly silencing the scream. The force of the impact sent them both crashing to the ground, and as the other paratroopers hurried forward, Davis's dying act was to raise his weapon one last time. The machine gun's barrel levelled with the creature atop him, emptying a burst directly into its head, shattering its skull. Before the first man could reach the two bodies, Grey Wolf was already in front of them, pistol raised, right hand resting on the hilt of the tribal axe that hung from his belt. The corporal took in the looks of horror on the faces of his men, before realising it was not him they beheld, but the grisly scene behind him. The Native American turned to see Davis's body twitching and spasming, its feet violently lashing out and arms reaching for empty air. Gradually, this attack seemed to subside, before it suddenly sat bolt upright, head snapping round to face its former comrades. The thing that had once been Private Davis uttered a throaty and intimidating rasp, its mouth opening wide. Already, the colour in its skin was inexplicably fading away. Its eyes were beginning to produce the same yellow glow as that of its killer. It emitted a prolonged hiss and then started to stagger unsteadily to its feet, leering hungrily at its colleagues. In an instant, Grey Wolf had covered the short distance that lay between him and the creature, burying the tomahawk directly into the centre of its skull. It emitted an ear-splitting howl, an unearthly mixture of pure anger and utter agony, before it slumped back down to the ground. For a second, an eerie silence again descended on the ruined clearing, before off in the distance, a similar cry suddenly sounded in reply. Aware of the shocked and horrified looks on the faces of the young men under his command, Mallinson acted quickly, ordering Mackenzie to organise a defensive position in the middle of the clearing and to burn the two mangled bodies lying a short distance away. He turned to face Grey Wolf. The corporal's features betrayed no emotion, instead belying he was deep in thought. Mallinson spoke slowly and deliberately, demanding to know what it was that had just killed one of his men. There was a long pause, leading him to angrily repeat the question, before the NCO's gaze finally met his. Grey Wolf quietly explained that he had heard stories of such monsters when he had been a child growing up near the Columbia River. His people, the Chinook, did not believe in such dark magic, but they had often been told troubling tales relating to such matters by the neighbouring Algonquian tribes. It was widely rumoured amongst the peoples of the Great Plains there had been instances where warriors had been transformed into cruel and murderous creatures, having entered into an arrangement with an ancient evil. By uttering a form of curse, they allowed these beings to enter their body, changing and altering its form from within. Such a bargain was made at a time when the warriors saw no other way to survive, such as facing overwhelming odds in battle, or having been exiled from their tribe. Facing imminent death or disgrace, the subject would offer up his human body to a demon, which would then possess it and use it to wreak havoc on those that had wronged it. The union of the disgraced warrior's body and the vengeful demon was known as the Wikitao, or Wendigo. This creature was strong and fast, but painfully malnourished, always in search of living beings to consume. When the Wendigo feasted on others, it would automatically pass the warrior's curse onto its prey, instantly creating more monsters with which to visit revenge on mankind. There was no way to take back these dark words once they had been spoken, meaning that only the most desperate or shameful of warriors had ever uttered them. The Wendigo existed for one purpose, and one purpose only, to inflict pain and suffering on those responsible for its creation. Grey Wolf now paused, reflecting on the scream they had heard deeper off in the woods. He told Mallinson he believed that in one of the parties that had gone before them, there must have been a native soldier who knew of the curse and had chosen to speak it as the Germans had been at the point of ending his life. Depending on how much of a fight had gone on in the clearing before they arrived, they could be facing up to 50 of these creatures, plus however many Germans had also been infected. Mallinson nodded, finding the words spoken by the corporal difficult to digest, but now increasingly easy to believe. He suggested they withdraw, in order to notify the battalion about what had taken place, but as he turned to give the order, Grey Wolf grasped him by the arm. There was no way they could outrun these things, which were almost certainly coming for them now, as a result of the death cry of the one they'd killed. They were better armed and forewarned than those that had gone before them. If the paratroopers made a stand here and now, they may just live to tell their tale. There was a long pause as Mallinson sized up their options before he reluctantly agreed and called for Mackenzie to join them. He had half expected the sergeant to mock Grey Wolf's story, but as the smell of the burning bodies drifted across the clearing, Mackenzie nodded in agreement. Realising they had little time to prepare, the three men agreed a hasty plan of action before hurrying back to reorganise their defence. Whilst Grey Wolf and several of the others began to construct a defensive rampart amongst the downed tree trunks at the centre of the clearing, Mackenzie had directed the rest of the company to start collecting up more wood in order to create a slightly broader barricade. Sat at the edges of this simple obstruction would be the two flamethrower teams, consisting of an operator and a pair of spotters. These men would use the weapons to herd the attackers into the centre of the barricade, where the company's heavy machine gun crew waited to cut them to pieces. Should their assailants be too numerous and this plan were to fail, the NCOs would order the survivors to fall back to the stockade, where they would use any and all of their remaining weapons to drive off whatever attackers still lived. As he walked amongst the men, helping them ready their weapons and equipment, Mule began to feel his spirits rising. Numerous grenades had been piled up in readiness, and each man had plenty of ammunition ready at hand. Regardless of how many of these creatures might attack or how fast they could move, they would have to cover significant ground before reaching the barrier, where they would face a wall of flame and gunfire. Surely, this would be enough to stop them. He glanced across to Grey Wolf, who'd just finished shoring up the remaining gaps in the laager he had been constructing. The corporal caught sight of him, raising a thumbs up to signify he was content they'd done enough to craft a suitably defensible position. As he did so, a deafening and inhuman shriek issued forth from the trees behind them, sending each of the men running to take up their agreed positions. The American soldiers now anxiously scanned the clearing for any sign of movement, but there was none. Then, off to their right, deep within the trees, an agonised wail suddenly commenced. Somewhere nearby, a woman's voice loudly mourned the loss of her husband. As this sobbing lamentation began to escalate in volume, another voice then joined in, a short distance away. Someone was shouting loudly in German. Although the men could not understand the words that were spoken, it was clear the speaker was agitated, venting anger on someone else. Then this was joined by a child's voice, crying out in fear, asking for its brother. Behind their improvised defences, the waiting soldiers pulled their weapons a little closer, fingers tightening around the triggers. More voices joined in now, both in English and other languages they didn't recognise. Some scared, some rageful. Men, women and children, all emanating from the trees that surrounded them. As this deafening chorus of garbled dialogue continued to issue forth, they caught glances of shadowy figures moving around just inside the dark protection of the trees. A fleeting shadow here, a glimpse of a skeletal silhouette there. Sometimes the momentary blinking of a pair of glowing yellow eyes, before they too quickly receded into the darkness. Movement everywhere, all accompanied by a rising crescendo of loud and chaotic voices. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the unearthly shouting ceased. An oppressive and haunting silence descended on the clearing, not even the singing of the birds audible to the men crouched down there. Nothing made a sound, and nothing moved, and then the gates of hell seemed to open up. From all around the remaining members of the 551st, terrifying emaciated creatures suddenly erupted forth from the depths of the Belgian forest. Some were bedecked in the torn uniforms of US infantrymen, others wore tattered camouflage smocks similar to the SS soldiers they'd encountered during previous confrontations. But all were truly terrifying to behold. Their bleached skin faded to the colour of ivory, tightened and pulled back to the point where it barely covered the bones protruding beneath it. None carried weapons. Instead, their gnarled and clawed hands empty and outstretched before them. The clearing was filled with 100 cries of angry hisses as the monsters rushed from their hiding places, arms hungrily reaching out for their prey. Some ran in a crouched position low to the ground, some leapt and bounded, but all moved at breakneck speed towards the waiting line of paratroopers. Mule yelled, and immediately twin bursts of flame blossomed forth from the sides of the barricade. The sprinting figures at the leading edges of the attacking horde disappeared suddenly from sight, consumed by a fiery wave of smoking flame that seemed to dissolve them entirely. Instinctively, the monsters nearest this destruction began to stumble and veer away, seemingly desperate to avoid the same fate. As the mass of snarling and clawing horrors bunched closer together, their howls of hate and indignation were now drowned out by a new sound. A murderous stream of 50 caliber rounds hammered into their midst, from the Browning M2 being operated at the centre of the barricade. Rib cages shattered, limbs splintered and skulls exploded as the gunners worked their weapon back and forth amidst the undulating mass of death and hate that lay before them. For the briefest of moments, it seemed the progress of the creatures had been checked, the speed of their advance slowing ever so slightly as the steady rate of fire from the machine gun played back and forth across the centre of their ranks. But still they came on, tripping and stumbling across the bodies of their fallen, howling and hissing with rage. The rest of the defenders now instinctively opened fire, requiring no order to do so. Rifles and machine pistols barked, spitting death into the attackers, but barely had any impact. Mallinson heard a panicked cry to his right and turned to see Marino and Enzo fleeing from the trees, pursued by two of the monstrosities. Behind them, the lone paratrooper directing the right flank's M2 flamethrower yelled in frustration before turning to continue his business, now undefended. As Mule yelled for Mackenzie to assist, the world seemed to slow to a crawl around him. From outside of his field of vision, the flamethrower operator didn't see the pair of pale figures dressed in tattered human uniforms that now turned and abandoned their pursuit of the two Americans. By the time he did, it was too late, with the monsters crashing into him, biting and slashing away in a frenzy. As his body vainly tried to resist the death that was claiming it, the dying man reflexively triggered the flamethrower, incinerating a couple of paratroopers who had been running to his aid. In moments, Mackenzie was there, hammering and smashing the creatures with his Garand. Having cleaved open the skull of one, he was angrily beating away at the prone form of the other when the body of the flamethrower operator lurched upright behind him. Mackenzie turned to see the drooling figure bearing down on him, fuel pouring from the damaged tank still strapped to its back, and realised there would be no escape. As the undead paratrooper barreled into him, it barely registered the unpinned grenade that was promptly shoved in its jacket, before both it and its victim disintegrated in a fiery inferno. The undulating mass of horrors now veered sharply away from the machine gun's deadly arc of fire towards the exposed right flank of the barricade. They stumbled and fell over the top of the barrier, reaching for the paratroopers behind it with sharp claws, latching onto them. Mule watched on helplessly as man after man disappeared beneath the seething mass of monsters, their cries lost amidst the roars of triumph that issued forth from their killers. Choking back tears of frustration, he fired a volley into the group nearest to him, and then yelled for the rest of the survivors to fall back. The order came far too late. Off to his left, the second flamethrower operator was ablaze, staggering backwards with two burning monsters clinging to his body. The machine gun party had bravely kept up their fire to the very last, before they too had been torn to pieces by what had once been their comrades. Less than 5 men were now alive, running for the stockade. Grey Wolf and the men alongside him were firing, short, sharp bursts in an effort to slow down the approaching Wendigo herd. Bullets whistled and cracked across the clearing, shattering knees and ankles, sending some of the beasts to the ground. Their numbers were depleted, the gunners having ensured that their lives were not lost in vain. His carbine empty, Mallinson turned and hurled it at the nearest monster, watching as the monstrosity was tripped up and grounded by the flying weapon. But as it had dropped to the floor, another launched itself forward, using its fallen brother as a springboard. A spindly arm caught hold of one of the loops of Mule's webbing, sending him crashing down along with its owner. As he rolled onto his back, Mule's pistol automatically came up, unloading round after round into his attacker, But it was no good. More were coming, countless clawed hands reaching for him. Two of the beasts fell on his outstretched legs, faces leering up at him, jaws wide open. And then Grey Wolf was among them, the tomahawk wielding wildly from side to side. As he dispatched Mule's first attacker, the other seemed to look at the weapon in amazement, as if recognising it from some long, distant memory. All around Mule, more of his men were running forward now, firing their weapons or wielding them like clubs. The number was no longer in their favour, but that didn't matter. This fight was about one thing and one thing only: hate. Which side hated the other the most? Which was prepared to lose anything in order to prevail? Clambering to his feet and yanking the bayonet from his belt, Mallinson roared with true unbridled rage and led his men forward. Moments later, he was again thrown to the ground as a hurtling figure impacted into him from the side. He slashed out wildly with the bayonet, feeling it connect sharply with the skull of his assailant. But at the same time, there was a blinding pain to the right side of his ribs as the creature's claws dug in hard and deep. Mule coughed and felt the bitter metallic taste of blood in his mouth. He kicked out desperately, feeling his boot connect with something that then crunched and broke beneath it. Darkness crept into the sides of his vision, and the world started to disappear around him. He heard Grey Wolf somewhere nearby, roaring like a man possessed, and then there was nothing. When Mule came to, the pain in his side was close to unbearable. He cried out, and the paratrooper that was carrying him immediately set him down onto the ground. He was thirsty, overwhelmingly so, and begged for water, snatching hungrily at the canteen that was then offered. He drank, like he'd never drunk before copping up a hot mixture of water and blood. His head rolled lazily to one side, and he could see they were now back out of the woods, walking back in the direction from which they'd first entered. 3 of his soldiers were knelt around him, offering words of encouragement, and there were lorries parked up nearby. He again pleaded for water, seemingly unable to quench the thirst inside him, before pulling himself up to his knees, hungrily draining another canteen. Glancing down at the hands that held the water bottle, Mule cried out suddenly, seeing how taut and pale the skin was. He dropped the canteen in horror, examining them more closely, watching as the nails on both hands began to lengthen and become sharper. With a pained scream he fell forwards, the blood he was coughing up onto the ground now jet black in colour. No matter how hard he rubbed at his eyes, his vision continued to deteriorate and blur, taking on a haunting yellowy tinge. Mule was growing hungry, hungrier than he ever had in his entire life. He suddenly felt his spine crack and snap, causing painful contortions that shot throughout his whole body. As he screamed out loud, he heard the pain in his voice morphing into an uncontrollable rage. He staggered to his feet, feeling teeth cutting deep into the skin inside his lips and mouth. Speech was impossible, his swollen tongue lolling uselessly to one side, failing to respond to his will. Desperately he looked around, searching for a way to make the hunger stop, and then a gunshot rang out. The last thing that the little humanity remaining inside Mallinson was aware of was Johnny Grey Wolf. The big corporal was stood a few feet away, pistol smoking in his hand, tears rolling down his face. Had he been capable of smiling at that point, the dying officer would have used his last few moments to do so, but this terrible curse had robbed him of even that comfort, as well as his only possible hope of survival.